I never liked hunting alone, but that season I had no choice. My usual hunting partner, a longtime friend named Mark, had moved out of state for work, and no one else I knew was free. I didn't want to waste my hunting permit, so I figured I could handle a few days out in the woods by myself. I had done it before, but never for more than a night or two. The cabin I planned to stay in belonged to an old friend of my father's, a man named Walter. He had built it decades ago and used it for hunting trips until he got too old to make the long trek into the woods. It was a small structure, just enough for 1 or 2 people, with a single cot, a wood stove, and a table with a few old chairs. No electricity, no plumbing, just a shelter from the elements. The drive up to the trailhead was rough. The road was just dirt and rocks, and after a recent rain, it was all mud. My truck struggled a few times, sliding in places where the ruts were deep, but I made it to the small clearing where the trail began. From there, it was a long hike about 4 miles through thick woods. The air was cold and damp, the kind that gets into your bones. I had been to the cabin before, but it had been years. I knew the way, though, and as I hiked, I kept an eye out for signs of deer, tracks, broken twigs, anything that might give me an idea of where to set up in the morning. I carried my rifle slung over my shoulder, just in case. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, tucked between the trees like it had grown there. The place was in worse shape than I remembered. The wood was gray from age, the roof sagged in one corner, and the door looked like it had been chewed on by animals. The last time I had been here, it had been in better shape, but Walter was long past keeping it up. I stepped onto the porch, testing the wood with my boot. Creaked but held. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, old dust, and something else. Something faint but sour, like old sweat or mildew. I set my pack down inside and looked around. The inside was just as I remembered. The small cot against the wall, the iron stove with a pile of old wood next to it, and the single table with its 2 chairs. I checked for signs of animals getting inside, no nests, no droppings, just dust and cobwebs. I swept the place out as best I could, then went to collect some more firewood before dark. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I had a good fire going in the stove. The cabin warmed up fast, and the air lost that damp chill. I ate a quick meal from a can, washed it down with water from my canteen, and stretched out on the cot. I didn't sleep right away. Something about the place felt off. It wasn't fear exactly, more like unease, like the woods were watching. I told myself it was just being alone. I was used to having Mark around to talk to, used to the noise of another person moving around. Without that, the silence felt heavy. I finally drifted off, but sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange light against the walls. I lay there listening. Then I heard it. A sound outside, soft but close. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The trees creaked sometimes, and branches rubbed together in ways that made odd noises. But this was different. It was deliberate. A slow, careful step. Then another. I stayed still, barely breathing. I reached for my rifle where it rested against the wall. My fingers wrapped around the stock, my heart beat heavy in my ears. The steps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then something brushed against the wall of the cabin. A light, dragging sound, like fingers running along the wood. I sat up, every muscle in my body tight. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer passing through, a bear maybe, though they usually made more noise. But something about the way it moved felt wrong. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The fire had died completely, and the air was cold again. I sat up, rubbing my arms, and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was damp from the recent rain, and if something had been out there, it might have left tracks. It did. Just beyond the porch, in the soft mud, were footprints.
Barefoot.
They weren't animal tracks. They were human, and they led from the trees to the cabin and then back into the woods. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been walking around my cabin in the middle of the night, barefoot. I looked back at the trees, scanning for movement. Nothing. The forest was still. I thought about packing up and hiking back to my truck, but I had spent all that effort getting out here. I tried to tell myself it was some drifter, maybe a lost hiker, but I knew better. No one hiked this deep into the woods barefoot. Not at night, not without a light. I spent the day hunting, but my mind wasn't on it. I barely saw any deer, and when I did, I wasn't focused enough to get a clean shot. I kept thinking about those footprints, about whoever had been outside my cabin. That night, I locked the door. The latch wasn't much, just an old metal hook, but it was better than nothing. I built up the fire and sat up late, listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they came right up to the door. I gripped my rifle, my body tense. The handle rattled just slightly. I don't know if they were testing it or if they knew I was awake. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a long moment, the footsteps moved away. Slow, steady, back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, stepped outside, and looked at the ground. The footprints were there again. More of them, and they had circled the cabin. I started hiking. I walked fast, my rifle in my hands, scanning the trees as I went. Every snap of a twig made my pulse jump. I made it back to my truck without seeing anyone, but I didn't stop to rest. I tossed my gear in the back, climbed in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked back once, just for a second, and I saw him, a man standing just at the tree line, tall, thin, bare-chested despite the cold. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I never went back to that cabin. I had spent the last 6 weeks working in the deep woods, helping to build a remote hunting cabin for a man I barely knew. It was the kind of job that didn't require many questions, just long hours, steady hands, and the ability to deal with the isolation. The pay was good, better than most jobs back home, and I needed it. The man paying for the cabin, James Larkin, was one of those quiet types, the kind that looked like he had seen things but wasn't about to talk about them. He'd come out to check on the progress every week or so, always arriving alone, always leaving before dark. I never asked why. The location was about as far from civilization as you could get without needing a passport. No roads led directly to it, just an overgrown dirt path barely wide enough for a truck. We were surrounded by trees, thick and towering, the kind that blocked out the sky even in the middle of the day. The nearest town was over 50 miles away, and the only other people I had seen were the ones working alongside me. But one by one, they finished their shifts and left. Now it was my last night. The cabin was nearly done, just a few finishing touches left. James had already wired me my final payment, told me he'd come check on the place in a few days. There was no reason for me to stay past the next morning. I should have left earlier. The evening was calm, the way it always was out here. No sounds except the rustling of the wind in the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I had spent the day sealing the last few boards, making sure everything was tight and weatherproof. It was solid work, nothing fancy, but it would hold up against the cold and the storms. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. My truck was packed, my tools stored away. All that was left was one last night in the place I had built. I made a small fire outside, cooked up a can of beans and some jerky, sat back against a log. The air was cool but not cold, the sky dark but clear. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had spent enough time in the woods to know when something felt off. Tonight, something felt off. I listened. Nothing. No crickets, no owls, no distant howls from coyotes. Just the wind, steady but light, shifting through the trees. I wasn't scared. Not yet. But I was alert. I let the fire burn down low, then stomped out the last embers. No need to attract any more attention than necessary. I locked up the cabin and went inside. The place was simple, one big room with a loft, a sturdy door, small windows. Nothing luxurious, but it would serve its purpose. My cot was set up in the corner, just a thin mattress on a metal frame. I lay down on it, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easy. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. Something had changed. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized there was no wind. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Then I heard it, a soft creak. The porch. My heart started to pound, but I didn't move. I listened. Another creak. Slow, careful. Something was stepping onto the porch. I reached for my knife, the one I kept beside the cot. I didn't have a gun. Didn't think I'd need one out here. Stupid. The cabin had no electricity, just a lantern on the table. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. I strained my ears. Another creak. Then, nothing. Minutes passed. I held my breath. Then, a slow, deliberate tap on the window. Not a knock. Tap. Light. Testing. I tightened my grip on the knife. My truck was parked outside, but my keys were in my bag on the table. I'd have to move to get them. Too risky. I waited. Then, footsteps. Moving away. I didn't relax, not yet. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were comfortable out here. That was worse than anything. After what felt like an hour, I finally moved. I reached for my keys as quietly as I could, keeping my eyes on the door, the windows. Another sound, not from the porch, from the roof. A slow, deliberate shift of weight, with settling under pressure. I had built this cabin with my own hands. I knew every inch of it. There was no reason for anything to be up there. I felt the blood drain from my face. My breathing slowed. Then the worst sound yet. A scrape, like nails or a knife dragging across the wooden shingles. I gritted my teeth. This wasn't random. This wasn't an animal. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I had to move. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder. I crept to the door, turned the handle as slowly as possible.
No noise.
I stepped outside. The air was cold now, colder than it should have been. The moon cast just enough light to see. I looked up. Nothing. The roof was empty, but the woods weren't. A shape just beyond the tree line, standing still, watching. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran for my truck, threw the door open, shoved the key in. The engine roared to life. Movement. Fast. From the trees. I slammed the door, jammed the truck into reverse, spun the wheel. The tires skidded in the dirt, then caught. Headlights swept across the trees. Nothing there. I didn't care. I gunned it down the path, branches scraping against the sides, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. Didn't stop until I was miles away. James called me 2 days later. He said he had checked on the cabin, said everything was still there, untouched. No signs of anyone. I didn't argue, didn't tell him what happened. I just told him I wasn't coming back. I never went that deep into the woods again, and I never will. I inherited the farm cabin from my uncle, who passed away in the fall of 2018. It wasn't a grand inheritance, just an old wooden house on a patch of land that hadn't been used for real farming in years. The place sat deep in the countryside, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but fields and patches of woods surrounding it. He had lived alone there for as long as I could remember, and when he died, no one in the family seemed interested in taking over the property. My parents suggested selling it, but something about it drew me in. I needed a change at the time. City life had drained me, and the thought of living out in the open, with no neighbors and no noise, felt like the kind of escape I needed. I had no plans to farm, but I figured I could make something out of it. Maybe restore the place, turn it into a getaway spot. The first time I saw the cabin in person, I realized how much work it needed. The wooden boards on the exterior were warped and cracked, the roof sagged in places, and the inside smelled like dust and mold. The furniture, which had been there since my uncle's time, was old and creaky. The place had electricity, but it was unreliable, and the plumbing barely functioned. Still, I convinced myself I could fix it up. I moved in late October. The weather was already turning cold, and the days were short. The first few nights felt strange. The silence was unsettling. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that made you hyper-aware of every sound. The wind against the windows, the occasional rustling outside. I chalked it up to animals. There were plenty of them out here. Foxes, deer, raccoons, probably even coyotes. During the day, I worked on repairs. I patched up the roof, reinforced some of the walls, and cleared out the old furniture. I also found things my uncle had left behind: tools, notebooks, and an old shotgun in the closet. The gun wasn't loaded, but I found a box of shells tucked away in the kitchen drawer. I kept it close at night, not because I was scared of anything in particular, but because it felt like something I should do. A week in, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. It began with small things, objects not being where I left them, faint noises at night that didn't quite sound like animals, footsteps in the dry leaves outside. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Living in isolation can do that to you. But then, one night, I found something that made me sure I wasn't alone out here. I had gone to bed early, but a noise woke me up, something moving outside. I grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun and went to check. The night was cold, my breath visible in the air. I scanned the yard but saw nothing. I was about to turn back when I noticed the barn door was slightly open. I knew I had closed it earlier. I moved slowly, listening for anything inside. The barn was just as old as the cabin, filled with rusted tools and broken equipment. I stepped in, sweeping the flashlight around. Something had been in there. The dirt floor had fresh marks, footprints. They weren't from an animal. They were human. I backed out and locked the barn. My heart was pounding. I went back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I checked around the property. Nothing seemed out of place except for those tracks in the barn. I found more near the tree line, but they didn't lead anywhere specific. They just stopped, like whoever had been walking around had carefully retraced their steps. I started keeping the shotgun loaded. For the next few nights, the noises continued. More footsteps, more rustling in the woods. I started staying up late, watching through the windows, but I never saw anything. Then, one night, something happened that made me decide I needed to leave. It was past midnight, and I was sitting in the dark, staring out the window. The moon was out, casting a pale light over the fields. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching the cabin. My skin went cold. I turned off the light and grabbed the shotgun. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night, Every sound made my heart race. I considered calling the police, but the nearest station was miles away, and what would I even say? That I saw someone outside? That I heard noises? The next morning, I made up my mind. I started packing my things, deciding I'd leave the next day. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. That night, the noises were louder. I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then, a soft scraping against the front door. My hands tightened around the shotgun. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. I sat there for hours, waiting for something to happen. The wind howled outside, but nothing else came. At dawn, I grabbed my bags, loaded everything into my truck, and left. I didn't look back. I never went back to the cabin. I never tried to sell it, never told anyone what happened. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. They weren't just passing through. They had been there before, and they were waiting for me to leave. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My husband, Daniel, had been talking about renting a cabin for months. We lived in a city where everything was too fast, too loud, and too crowded. He wanted a break from it all, and honestly, so did I. When he finally found a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town, I agreed. The drive took almost 6 hours. The roads narrowed as we went deeper into the forest, and by the time we reached the dirt path leading to the cabin, it was almost dark. The trees were thick, towering over the road, their branches nearly touching the truck as we passed. There was no phone signal. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, but Daniel had printed out directions just in case. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. It was old but sturdy, built from thick logs with a slanted metal roof. There was a small porch, a stack of firewood by the door, and a single light above the entrance. Inside, it was basic but comfortable: 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a fireplace. The place smelled of wood and dust. Daniel dropped our bags by the couch and stretched his arms. "We'll get the rest from the truck in a minute," he said. I nodded and walked to the kitchen to check the cabinets. There were some old canned goods left behind, but we had brought our own food. The windows were small, and when I looked outside, all I could see was darkness. The trees seemed even closer now, pressing in on us. Daniel lit the fireplace and we settled in for the night. The cabin creaked every now and then, but I told myself it was just the wood settling. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. There was bound to be some noise. The first night passed without incident, but by the second night, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sense that something was off. The forest felt too quiet. During the day, we didn't hear any birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. At night, it was even worse. The silence felt unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind. A soft crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. I turned to Daniel, but he was already asleep. I held my breath, listening. Crunch. I sat up slowly. The sound was closer now, near the front of the cabin. I reached out and shook Daniel's shoulder. He mumbled something but didn't wake up. I didn't want to move, but I had to know what was out there. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and walked to the window. The glass was cold against my fingertips as I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The porch light barely illuminated the clearing. The trees loomed in the darkness, their shapes blending together. First, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, a man standing completely still, watching the cabin. He was too far to make out his face, but the way he stood, unnatural, stiff, it made my stomach twist. I stayed frozen, hoping he would turn and walk away. But he didn't. He just stood there. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. I don't know how long I stood at the window, heart pounding. Then, as if he knew I was watching, he moved. Not towards the cabin, not away, just a single, slow step to the side. I let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window. My hands were shaking. I climbed back into bed and pressed my body against Daniel, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would wake him. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke up, the sun was filtering through the curtains. Daniel was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. I hesitated before checking the window. There was nothing there. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been standing there the night before. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The day passed slowly. We hiked through the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, convinced I would see that figure standing between the trees. But there was nothing. That night, I locked the door and shut all the curtains before we went to bed. Daniel joked that I was being paranoid, but I didn't care. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was louder this time, more distinct. Crunch, crunch. I gripped Daniel's arm, shaking him hard. This time he woke up. He listened for a moment, then got out of bed. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and walked to the front door. I wanted to tell him not to open it, but I couldn't speak. He unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch, shining the light into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty woods. But I knew something was out there. Daniel sighed and shook his head. Nothing, probably just an animal. He shut the door and locked it again. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake, listening, waiting. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. Daniel's face went pale when he saw them. The prints led from the tree line to the porch, circling around the cabin before disappearing back into the woods. Someone had been out there walking around while we slept, watching us. We packed up that morning. Neither of us said much, but we both knew we weren't staying another night. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood in the clearing, small and quiet. The forest swallowed it whole as we turned onto the dirt road, heading back to civilization. We never spoke about it again. We never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure in the trees, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting. I inherited the cabin after my grandfather passed away. It sat deep in the woods of southern France, an old army shelter from decades ago, long since abandoned by the military and passed down through the family. My grandfather had spent his final years here, living alone, keeping to himself. He had never spoken much about his time in the army, nor why he chose to retire in a place so isolated, but I never questioned it. He was a man of few words, a man who had seen things he didn't want to talk about. I had only been to the cabin once before when I was a child. I remembered it as a dark, cold place, the trees pressing in too close, the silence of the forest making me uneasy even then. Now, I was an adult and the property was mine. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. Sell it, maybe, or fix it up and rent it out. I didn't have any sentimental attachment to the place. It was just another responsibility I had inherited. The drive out there took hours. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, narrowing until the trees seemed to swallow it completely. I had a map, but no GPS signal. My phone had lost service miles back. I drove slowly, the thick woods on either side of me blocking out the sky. It felt like I was driving into a place that time had forgotten. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked even worse than I remembered. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. The windows were dirty, the glass streaked and cloudy. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them. And when I unlocked the door, the hinges groaned as if the cabin itself was protesting my presence. Inside, it was exactly as my grandfather had left it. The air was stale, dust coating every surface. Old furniture sat in the dim light, an armchair, a small wooden table, a single bed against the far wall. Military gear was still scattered around, neatly stored in crates and cabinets. There were old rifles, rusted knives, stacks of yellowed maps. A lantern sat on the table, its glass smudged with soot. I set down my bag and exhaled. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and age. I had planned to spend a few nights here, clean up the place, go through my grandfather's things, and decide what to do next. The first night, I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, cooked a simple meal, and settled in. The quiet was oppressive. No sounds of cars, no distant hum of civilization. Just the wind in the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I slept uneasily, waking often to the sounds of the woods outside. Something moved through the trees, a branch snapping, footsteps in the undergrowth. At first, I told myself it was just animals. Wild boars were common in this part of France, as were deer. But there was something about the way the sounds came and went, stopping suddenly, that made me uneasy. The next day, I explored the property. The cabin sat on a clearing of land, but beyond it, the forest was thick and untouched. I found an old well, long since dried up, and a rusted-out truck half buried in the undergrowth. My grandfather had never mentioned a vehicle. It must have been here for decades, the windows shattered, vines growing through the frame. I spent the afternoon cleaning, sorting through his belongings. I found a stack of old notebooks, filled with tight, cramped handwriting, military notes, records of his time in service. Some pages were just lists, supplies, dates, coordinates. Others were more personal, accounts of long nights spent in the cabin, of things he had seen. One entry caught my eye. It was dated nearly 20 years ago. Asterisk, I saw it again last night, watching from the trees. I don't know what it wants. It doesn't come closer, just stands there. I don't sleep anymore. Asterisk, I frowned, flipping through the pages. There were more entries like it scattered throughout the years. Mentions of a figure in the woods, of unease, of not feeling alone. I closed the notebook, trying to shake the feeling that crept up my spine. It was nothing, just the ramblings of an old man living alone in the wilderness for too long. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were closer. I sat up in bed, listening. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the leaves. Then silence. Then another step. I reached for the flashlight by my bed, clicking it on. The beam shone through the window, illuminating the trees outside. Nothing, just darkness and the swaying branches. I barely slept. When morning came, I found tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. Not animal tracks, footprints, bare feet. The prints led from the treeline to the cabin, circling it. I spent the day reinforcing the doors, checking the locks on the windows. My grandfather had kept a rifle, and I made sure it was loaded. That night, I stayed awake, waiting. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside. Then, around midnight, the footsteps returned. Closer this time. Slow, careful. I gripped the rifle, heart pounding. The cabin felt impossibly small, the walls too thin. I heard breathing, right outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then a long, dragging scrape against the wood. fingernails or something like them. I raised the rifle, pointing it at the door, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. But nothing came, just the breathing, the scraping. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep. When dawn finally came, I opened the door to find deep scratch marks in the wood, long and deliberate. I packed my things, got into my car, and left. I didn't care about selling the place. I didn't care about whatever inheritance my grandfather had left behind. I didn't look back. It started as a simple getaway. I needed time away from everything. Work, city life, the constant pressure that never seemed to ease up. My dog, Buck, was my only company, and that was how I preferred it. He was a big German shepherd, smart, protective, and the best companion I could ask for. I had found a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town or neighbor. It belonged to an old friend of my late father, a man named Harold. He hadn't used the place in years, and when I asked if I could stay for a while, he barely hesitated before handing me the key. He even warned me that the place might be in rough shape, but I didn't care. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted solitude. I loaded up my truck with enough supplies to last a few weeks. Food, water, extra clothes, batteries, and my rifle. Not because I expected trouble, but because out here you had to be prepared for anything. The drive took nearly 4 hours, half of which was spent on a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. The deeper I got into the woods, the more I felt the outside world slipping away. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by thick trees. It was old, weathered, but still standing. A front porch wrapped around the side, and a stack of firewood leaned against the wall. The windows were dusty, the door stiff from years of neglect, but inside, it was surprisingly intact. A single room with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a cot in the corner. Simple, but enough. Buck was restless the moment we stepped inside. He sniffed the air, ears twitching, eyes scanning the corners of the room. I figured he was just getting used to the place. He'd settle in soon enough. That night, I made a small fire, ate a quick meal, and sat outside on the porch with Buck lying at my feet. The woods were alive with sound, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. Then Buck growled. It was low, deep, almost a rumble in his chest. I followed his gaze, but the woods were nothing but darkness. I listened, but I heard nothing out of the ordinary. I placed a hand on his head, whispering his name, but he stayed rigid, ears perked, body tense. Eventually, he settled, but I didn't forget it. Over the next few days, I tried to relax. I spent my time chopping firewood, hiking, and just enjoying the quiet. But Buck was never at ease. He stayed close to me, always watching, always alert. The first real sign that something was wrong happened on the 4th night. I had just gone to bed, the fire in the fireplace reduced to embers, when Buck started growling again. This time it was different, more urgent. Then he barked, a sharp, aggressive sound that made my skin prickle. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it toward the window. Nothing, but Buck wouldn't stop. His tail was stiff, his body pressed low to the ground, staring at the door. I grabbed my rifle, heart pounding as I crept toward the window. The night was still, too still. No wind,
No crickets.
just silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the dry leaves outside. I held my breath, gripping the rifle tighter. I waited, listening, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped just beyond the porch. Buck was rigid beside me, every muscle in his body tense. Then nothing, no sound, No movement, just silence stretching on and on. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt. Human, but they weren't normal. They were barefoot, large, and deep as if whoever made them was heavy. The steps came from the woods, circled the cabin, and then stopped right in front of the door. I looked around, rifle in hand, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the stillness of the morning air. I told myself it was a hunter, maybe some lost camper, but I knew that wasn't true. No one came out this far, and if they did, why would they stand outside my cabin in the middle of the night? I tried to shake it off, but Buck wouldn't let me. He was different after that, more anxious, more aggressive. He wouldn't let me leave his sight. Even when I went to chop wood, he stayed inches from me, watching the tree line with an intensity one had never seen before. The next few nights were worse. Every night, the footsteps came back. Sometimes close, sometimes farther away, but always circling, always moving just beyond the porch. I stopped sleeping. I kept my rifle loaded, my flashlight close, waiting for whatever was out there to make a move. Then, on the 7th night, it did. I was sitting by the fire when Buck suddenly lunged toward the door, snarling. Then I heard it, something heavy slamming against the wall of the cabin. Not once, but twice. A deep, solid thud that made the wood shudder. I grabbed my rifle, my pulse racing as I stepped toward the door. Buck was barking like mad, his body pressed low, teeth bared. Then silence, and then scratching. Slow, deliberate, right against the wood of the door. Couldn't breathe. I raised my rifle, finger on the trigger, waiting for whatever was on the other side to break through. Then Buck lunged, slamming his body against the door so hard it rattled on its hinges. And just like that, the sound stopped. I waited, listening, heart hammering. Then footsteps, running this time, retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. The first light, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded the truck in record time, Buck jumping into the passenger seat the moment I opened the door. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and unmoving, standing at the edge of the tree line. Not running, not hiding, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until I reached civilization, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back. I never asked Harold about the cabin. I never wanted to know. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. And whatever it wanted, I wasn't sticking around to find out. All I know is that Buck saved me that night. If he hadn't been there, if he hadn't sensed it before I did, I don't like to think about what would have happened. All I know is that I'll never step foot in those woods again. And I'll never, ever ignore my dog's warning again. I hadn't seen my grandfather's cabin since I was a kid. It had been more than 20 years since I last stepped foot on that land, but I still remembered the smell of pine and damp earth, the way the trees swallowed the sky, and the feeling of being completely cut off from everything. When I got the letter about the inheritance, I was surprised. My grandfather had passed away months earlier, and I had assumed the land had gone to someone else. I barely knew the man. My father had always kept his distance from him, and by extension, so had I. But the cabin was mine now. I took a week off work and drove up into the mountains. The roads got narrower the deeper I went, the pavement giving way to dirt. The last few miles were rough, potholes and tree roots threatening to snap my truck's axles. But eventually, I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked almost exactly how I remembered. A single-story wooden structure, slanted roof, thick logs forming the walls. The windows were dark, some of the shutters hanging loose. The porch sagged slightly, and the whole place had a feeling of abandonment, like it had been left to the wild years ago. I parked the truck and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp wood. No sounds except the wind through the trees. No distant hum of traffic.
No voices.
Just the silence of the deep forest. The front door was locked, but I had the key. It took some effort to get it to turn. The lock was stiff from years of disuse, but eventually, it clicked open. The door creaked on its hinges as I stepped inside. Dust covered everything. The furniture was old but solid. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a single bed against the far wall, a cast iron stove in the corner. The air was stale, the smell of old wood and mildew thick. I spent the first hour sweeping out dust, opening windows, airing the place out. I checked the small generator out back, but it was dead. No power, which meant no lights except for my flashlight and the old oil lamp I found on a shelf. I didn't mind. I had come here for the solitude, for the quiet, a break from the constant noise of my life. As the sun set, I made a small fire in the stove. The warmth was welcome, chasing away the creeping cold that came with nightfall. I sat at the table, eating a can of beans with a metal spoon, listening to the sounds outside. Crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves, normal forest noises. But as the night deepened, I started to feel something else. It was subtle at first, a feeling, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar silence pressing in on me. Maybe it was the way the trees outside seemed too tall, too dense, their shadows stretching across the ground like fingers. I locked the door before I went to bed. I made sure the windows were latched, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing faintly. The room was cold. Then I heard it, a sound outside, a crunch, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the dead leaves. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon nosing through the underbrush. Then another crunch, closer. I sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight. I clicked it on, aiming it at the window, but the glass was fogged with condensation. I couldn't see anything outside. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. After a few minutes, I lay back down. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I found tracks outside. They weren't animal tracks, boot prints. Someone had been outside my cabin in the middle of the night, standing there, watching. I felt my stomach drop. The prints led from the tree line to the porch, then back again. Whoever it was had walked right up to my door. I spent the day on edge, checking the surroundings. The land stretched out for miles in every direction. No signs of other people, no sign of anyone living nearby. I tried to shake the feeling, but it stayed with me. That night, I kept my flashlight within arm's reach. I locked the door. I double-checked the windows. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The same slow footsteps. Crunch, pause, crunch. Closer this time. I sat up, gripping the flashlight. My hands were sweating. I aimed the beam at the window. For a split second, I thought I saw movement. A shape, a figure just beyond the trees. Then nothing. I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing outside, just beyond the reach of the light. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my things, locked the cabin, and got in my truck. I drove away without looking back. A few days later, I got a call from the lawyer handling my grandfather's estate. "There was something else left for you," he said. "A journal. Your grandfather's." I picked it up later that week. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed. My grandfather had kept notes about his time at the cabin, and towards the end, the entries changed. Short sentences, frantic handwriting. I'm not alone. I hear them at night. They watch from the trees. I left the journal on my desk and never opened it again. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I was 6 years into my job as a deputy when I got the call that would change everything. It was late autumn, cold enough for frost to linger past noon, but not yet winter. I was stationed in a quiet town, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened except the occasional bar fight or a lost hiker. We covered a large rural area, mostly thick woods, hunting land, and old properties that had been abandoned for years. Some of them had stories, strange disappearances, forgotten crimes, but most were just rotting pieces of history, left behind by people who had long moved on. That morning, I was sitting in my cruiser, sipping bitter coffee from a dented thermos, when dispatch crackled to life. A hunter had reported a cabin deep in the woods, past an old logging road. Said the place smelled awful. He had gone looking for a spot to set up a tree stand, but when he got close, the stink was so bad he couldn't ignore it. He thought it was a dead animal at first. Then he saw the door was slightly open, and what looked like blood smeared on the wood. He didn't go inside.
Smart man.
I acknowledged the call and started my drive, feeling a familiar weight settle in my stomach. I had a bad feeling about this one. The location was about an hour out, not too far from where I grew up. I knew these woods well. Old hunting grounds, overgrown trails that led to nowhere, places forgotten by time. The closer I got, the worse the roads became. Potholes deep enough to wreck a tire, roots breaking through the dirt. The last few miles were barely more than a trail, my cruiser bouncing over uneven ground. I finally reached a clearing where the hunter had said he parked. His truck was gone, but I saw his boot prints in the mud leading toward the tree line. I followed them, hand resting on my holster out of habit. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just that eerie stillness that makes the back of your neck prickle. Then the smell hit me. It was worse than roadkill. Thick, rotten, unmistakably human. I had smelled death before, drownings, house fires, suicides, but this was different. Lingering, settled deep into the wood and dirt. I followed the scent to the cabin. It was old, weathered, the kind of place that had been left to rot for decades. The door was slightly open, just as the hunter had described. Blood smeared near the handle, long dried. The windows were grimy, streaked with dirt and something darker. I stepped inside. The stench nearly made me gag. My eyes watered, throat clenched against the thick, cloying rot of decomposing flesh. Sunlight filtered through the slats in the walls, dust swirling in the beams. The floor was warped, boards creaking under my weight. Then I saw the body, slumped in the corner near the fireplace, barely recognizable as human. The skin was darkened, almost leathery, patches peeling away to expose bone. The hands were curled inward, fingernails blackened, arms stiff with rigor. The face, what was left of it, was a mess of sunken features and dried blood. Clothes torn, stained, maggots writhing in open wounds. Judging by the decay, the body had been here for weeks, maybe longer. I stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. That's when I noticed the odd things. The body wasn't just abandoned. It had been arranged, legs crossed, arms resting on the knees like some grotesque meditation pose. The skull was tilted slightly upward, mouth slightly open, as if mid-whisper. On the wall behind him, symbols had been carved into the wood. Deep gashes, jagged, uneven. Not words, at least not any I recognized. Some looked like tally marks, others like twisted shapes, spirals, slashes. The blood, the symbols, the arrangement of the body. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this, and someone had been here. I backed out of the cabin and radioed for backup. No way was I dealing with this alone. The dispatcher acknowledged, said the nearest deputy was 40 minutes out. I told her to send the coroner too. Then I waited. The woods stayed silent, but I felt like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig made my hand tighten around my gun. I kept scanning the tree line, waiting for something, anything to move. Nothing did. The other deputy, a guy named Reeves, showed up first. He took one step into the cabin and cursed under his breath. We cleared the place together, checking every corner, making sure whoever did this wasn't still around. The place was empty, just dust and decay. The coroner arrived an hour later, a quiet man named Lutz. He was a veteran in this line of work, had seen everything. But when he knelt by the body, his face went pale. "This isn't recent," he muttered. "But it's not as old as it should be either." That made no sense. The body was too decayed for just a few weeks, but too fresh for a year. Then we found something worse. A journal tucked under the floorboards. The leather cover was stiff, pages curled with moisture. Most of it was unreadable, but the last few entries were clear. They described a man hiding in the woods, paranoid, convinced someone was watching him. He wrote about hearing whispers at night, about seeing shapes moving between the trees. His last entry was just 2 words, scrawled in thick, uneven letters. "They're here." We searched the area, but the woods stretched for miles. No tracks, no signs of anyone living nearby. Just that dead man and his warnings. Over the next few weeks, we ran every test we could. The body didn't match any missing persons. No fingerprints in the cabin, no signs of forced entry. The coroner's final report was just as strange. Estimated time of death was uncertain. Some parts of the body suggested months, others years. The journal didn't help either. No name, no dates, no explanation. Just fear growing worse with each page. Eventually, the case went cold. The body was buried in an unmarked grave, the journal locked away in evidence. The cabin was left to rot, but I never forgot. Even now, years later, I think about that place, about the smell, the symbols on the walls, the way the body had been arranged, like it had been left there for a reason. And sometimes, when I drive past that stretch of woods, I swear I see something standing between the trees, watching, waiting, like it never really left. It was never meant to be anything more than a quiet weekend away. I had rented the cabin for a few nights, deep in the countryside of northern England, hoping for some solitude. Life had been weighing on me, and I needed the kind of peace that only isolation could bring. The cabin was small, the kind people usually used as hunting lodges or temporary retreats. It had a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a sitting area with an old wood-burning stove. The place was old, built decades ago, judging by the creaky wooden floors and the musty smell that hung in the air. It had been raining all day, the kind of steady downpour that made everything damp, even inside. The trees outside swayed, their skeletal branches tapping against the window glass like impatient fingers. I had arrived earlier in the afternoon, just before the worst of the rain began. The drive in had been long, the roads twisting through miles of open fields and dense forests. The cabin sat on the edge of an old wooded area, with no other houses for miles. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just me, the storm, and the thick silence of the countryside. By nightfall, the rain had become heavier, pounding against the roof with a relentless rhythm. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees and making the windows shudder in their frames. I had lit a fire in the stove, hoping to chase away the cold that was seeping into the cabin. The flames flickered, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. I had been reading for a while, wrapped in a thick blanket, listening to the rain. The book was old, something I had found on a dusty shelf in the cabin, one of those forgotten paperbacks that previous guests had left behind. I wasn't really paying attention to it. My mind kept drifting, unsettled by something I couldn't quite place. It was the feeling more than anything, that creeping sense that I wasn't alone. First, I ignored it. It was easy to explain away. Just the weather, the isolation, my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I glanced toward the window. The darkness outside was thick, impenetrable. The rain had turned the glass into a shifting canvas of water, distorting the view of the trees beyond. I could see nothing, but I felt it. Someone was out there. I told myself it was nonsense. There was no reason for anyone to be in the middle of the woods in weather like this. But the unease wouldn't leave me, pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stood up, moving toward the window, peering out into the blackness. The trees swayed, their wet branches shining under the dim glow of the cabin's light. Rain hammered the ground, turning the dirt path outside into a thick, sucking mud. I saw nothing, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The feeling of being watched had rooted itself deep in my gut, a primal instinct that refused to be ignored. I turned away from the window, trying to shake it off. I was being paranoid. That was all. I went to the kitchen, filling a glass with water from the tap. The pipes groaned, the old plumbing struggling against years of neglect. I drank, listening to the sounds of the storm, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the gnawing sense of unease. Then I heard it, a sound outside, faint, almost lost beneath the rain. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the mud. My body went cold. I stood frozen, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, another sound, closer. Someone was out there. I moved quietly to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The handle was locked, but that did nothing to ease my fear. If someone wanted in, the old lock wouldn't stop them. I waited. The only sound was the rain, the wind rattling against the walls. Minutes passed. Nothing. Had I imagined it? I stayed where I was, straining to hear. Then, just as I was about to step away, a single knock. Soft, almost polite. I stopped breathing. The knock came again. I didn't move. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. My legs were locked in place, my mind screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't. I could only stand there, frozen. Then, after what felt like hours, the knock stopped. Silence. I didn't dare move. I waited, my muscles tense, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the storm. Finally, after what felt like forever, I stepped away from the door. My body felt numb, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I moved back to the window, forcing myself to look outside. The rain blurred everything. The trees, the ground, the path leading away from the cabin. But there, just at the edge of the trees, a figure, standing still, watching. I couldn't see the face, just the outline of a person motionless in the rain. I stepped back, my pulse hammering. The figure didn't move. I turned away from the window, heart racing. I needed to think, to do something. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for a creak. Inside the cabin, behind me, I turned, my stomach dropping. The door was still locked, the windows shut, but the sound had been real. Inside, someone was in the cabin. I didn't think. I ran into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the wall, my mind racing. Had they been inside the whole time? Hiding? I listened, every nerve in my body on edge. Silence. Then a slow, deliberate knock. on the bedroom door. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to breathe. Couldn't stay in here. I had to get out. The window. I moved quickly, my hands fumbling with the latch. The glass was cold under my fingers, slick with condensation. I pushed it open, the rain pouring in. Another knock. I didn't look back. I climbed out, my feet sinking into the mud, the cold biting into my skin. I ran. The storm swallowed me, the rain blinding, the wind tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until the cabin was nothing but a distant shadow in the dark. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't hesitate. I kept going. I never went back, never found out who or what had been in that cabin with me. But sometimes on stormy nights, I still feel it, that creeping sensation, that I'm not alone. I never should have gone out there alone. Looking back now, I know that. But at the time, it seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I had been going through a rough patch. Work was draining. My relationship had fallen apart, and I just needed to get away. I wanted silence, isolation, and the cold, fresh air of the woods. I found a small cabin listed for rent online, tucked deep in the Blackwater Creek wilderness. It wasn't much. A single room, a wood stove, and an outhouse a short walk away. No electricity, no phone service, just the bare essentials. That was exactly what I was looking for. I packed up my truck with food, some camping gear, and a rifle. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because I'd be deep in the woods. Wild animals weren't uncommon in the area, and I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. The drive took me nearly 5 hours, the last hour of which was a rough, winding dirt road that seemed barely maintained. I passed no other cars, no signs of civilization, just thick trees pressing in on either side, their skeletal branches cutting into the gray winter sky. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to sink. The place was just as described, small, weathered, and sitting in a small clearing near the creek. It looked abandoned, the kind of place that hadn't seen visitors in a long time. I parked, grabbed my gear, and unlocked the door. The inside smelled of dust and old wood, and a few dead leaves had blown in through cracks in the window frame. There was a small bed against one wall, a table, a single wooden chair, and a stove in the corner. Simple. I liked that. I spent the first half hour setting up, bringing in wood from the pile outside, and lighting the stove. The temperature was already dropping fast, and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. That first night I felt at peace, but that didn't last. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee on the stove, and decided to explore the area. I hiked down to the creek, which was half frozen, and followed it for a while. The silence out there was thick. No birds, no rustling in the trees, just the crunch of my boots in the frost. After a few miles, I came across something strange. A set of footprints. Not animal tracks, but human. They were fresh, leading in the direction of my cabin. At first, I thought maybe it was a hunter or another camper, but I had seen no other vehicles or signs of people. And something about the tracks bothered me. The stride was off, too long in some places, uneven in others. I followed them back toward the cabin, feeling uneasy. But when I arrived, nothing seemed out of place. The door was still locked, my things untouched. Maybe I was overthinking it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The next evening, as the sun was setting, I was outside splitting some wood when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out a face, but close enough to see that it was a man. He didn't move, just stood there, half hidden by the trees, watching. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. My rifle was inside the cabin, out of reach, and I didn't want to take my eyes off him. I stayed still, gripping the axe in my hands. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into the woods. I waited, heart pounding, but he didn't come back. I told myself it was just some hiker passing through, maybe a hunter. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I barely slept that night, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind against the cabin walls. I should have left then, should have packed up my things and gotten out of there. But I didn't. The next morning, I checked the tree line where I had seen the man. There were tracks in the snow, but they didn't lead to a trail. They just circled the clearing. Around noon, I walked down to the creek again, hoping to clear my head. I was gone maybe an hour, but when I returned, the door to the cabin was open, wide open. I stopped in my tracks, heart hammering. I had locked it when I left. I was sure of that. Slowly, I stepped inside. Nothing looked out of place at first. My bag was still where I had left it, my food untouched. But then I saw the footprints in the dust. Someone had been inside. Someone had walked around the room. And then, right there on the table, I saw it. A knife, not mine, just an old, rusted hunting knife, placed neatly in the center of the table. I grabbed my rifle and backed out of the cabin. My first thought was to run, to get in my truck and leave. But the road was rough, narrow, and covered in ice. If he had done something to my truck, I'd be stuck. I checked under the hood. Everything seemed fine. The gas was still there. But when I got inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The keys. They weren't where I had left them. They were on the dashboard, neatly placed, like someone had been inside the truck, too. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. I locked the cabin door, checked my rifle, and sat in the chair facing the entrance. The stove crackled, the wind howled outside, and I waited. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the wall outside. Slow, deliberate. I gripped my rifle, every muscle in my body tense. The sound moved, circling the cabin. Footsteps crunching in the snow. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, I heard the sound of footsteps moving away. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, my rifle, and my keys and ran for the truck. The engine started on the first try, and I tore out of there, fishtailing on the icy road. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw him, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. He didn't move, didn't try to follow, just stood there, still as a statue, watching as I disappeared down the road. I never went back. I never reported it. What would I have said? That some man had stood outside my cabin? That he had left a knife in my cabin? Walked around my truck? None of it was a crime. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. When my grandfather passed away, I inherited his cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't the kind of place you'd imagine a retired soldier living. No cozy fireplace, no warm lights glowing from the windows at night. This was a structure built for function, not comfort. Thick wooden walls, a slanted tin roof, and a single narrow road leading in and out. My grandfather was a military man, and this cabin reflected that. I had only been to the cabin once when I was younger, too small to remember much. My father had never spoken fondly of the place. He said it was too far, too cold, too lonely. But he never said no when my grandfather asked him to visit. And now it was mine. I drove up the narrow road in the late afternoon, the sky thick with gray clouds that threatened rain. The trees closed in on both sides, their branches reaching over the dirt road like skeletal fingers. I had expected the cabin to be run down, but as I pulled up to it, I saw that it was still solid, standing like a stubborn old soldier against time. The first thing I noticed was the smell: wood, damp earth, and something metallic. I unlocked the door with the heavy iron key I had found among my grandfather's things and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my boots. It was a single-room cabin with a cot against one wall, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A shelf lined with canned food sat near the door, dust covering the labels. The air was thick with old memories. My grandfather had lived here for decades after retiring from the army. He had built the place himself, every nail and plank placed by his hands. I knew he had used it as a retreat, a place where he could be alone, where no one could bother him. I set my bag down near the cot and walked around, inspecting the place. The walls were lined with old army gear, canteens, a weathered rifle, a map pinned to the wood with faded markings. A single lantern sat on the table, its glass covered in a thin layer of grime. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. I didn't think much of it until I heard something else. A thud from behind the cabin. I froze. The noise had been heavy, not like a branch falling, but something solid hitting the ground. I stepped to the back window, peering through the glass. The woods stretched out, dark and unmoving. Nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind knocking something over. Maybe an old tool leaning against the cabin. But as I turned back toward the cot, I felt something. Presence. Not a ghost or anything supernatural, just the undeniable sensation that I was not alone. I shrugged it off, unpacked my things, and forced myself to settle in. The first night was quiet. I barely slept, my body too tense, my mind too alert. Every sound outside made me open my eyes. The wind against the trees, the groan of the roof as the cold night settled in. By morning, I felt foolish. It was just an old cabin in the woods. My grandfather had lived here for years without trouble. I spent the day cleaning. I wiped down the table, dusted off the shelves, and checked the old rifle. It was still loaded. That made me pause. My grandfather had left the cabin in a hurry. The cans of food were expired, but not by much. The bed was unmade. His boots sat by the door, as if he had planned to return. That night, I woke up to a noise outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Something heavy. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I stayed still, my breath caught in my chest. The footsteps stopped near the window. I reached for the rifle, my fingers closing around the cold metal. The cabin had no electricity, only the dim light of the moon through the window. I could see the shape of something moving outside. Not an animal, something taller. I held my breath. The shape moved past the window, heading toward the door. I didn't move. Then silence. Minutes passed. I listened, every nerve in my body on fire. I stayed like that until dawn, gripping the rifle, my eyes locked on the door. When the first light crept through the trees, I finally moved. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the clearing around the cabin. The dirt was soft from last night's rain, and there, in the mud, were footprints.
Bootprints.
Too large to be mine, too fresh to be my grandfather's. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. I followed the prints. They led toward the woods, then disappeared into the thick underbrush. Whoever it was, they had known to avoid leaving an obvious trail. I spent the rest of the morning reinforcing the door. I checked the locks. The rifle stayed by my side. That night, I stayed awake, listening. Nothing. The next night, nothing. By the third night, I started to relax. Maybe it had been a hunter passing through. Maybe just my imagination making things worse than they were. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps. Closer this time. I sat up, gripping the rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped at the door. A shadow passed by the window. Then came the sound of the doorknob turning. Slow, deliberate. I raised the rifle, my heart pounding. The knob twisted, but the lock held. Then silence. I waited. Nothing. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. By morning, the footprints were there again, circling the cabin this time. Whoever it was, they had taken their time walking around and around, just out of sight. That was enough for me. I packed my things, loaded the rifle, and left. I never went back. The cabin still stands, I'm sure, but it's not mine anymore. Let it rot. Let the woods take it. Whoever had been out there, they could have it. I never liked working alone at night, especially not in a place like that. It was the summer of 2009 when I took the job as a caretaker for an old graveyard on the outskirts of a small town in Oregon. I had just turned 30, struggling to keep up with bills, and this job seemed easy enough, watching over an abandoned cemetery that hardly anyone visited. The pay was decent for the little work involved, and it gave me a place to stay. That was the part one should have questioned more. The place they gave me was an old cabin, right in the middle of the graveyard. The cemetery was surrounded by thick pine trees, the kind that made everything feel darker even in the middle of the day. The main gate was rusted, the fencing uneven from years of neglect. Rows of headstones stretched out in all directions, some so old the names were unreadable. At the far end of the property, past a dirt path lined with cracked graves, was the cabin. It was a small, single-room structure with a sagging roof and wooden walls that looked like they had been standing for 100 years. The previous caretaker had lived there too, but I never got to meet him. All I knew was that he had quit suddenly and left without taking any of his things. That should have been my first warning. The first few nights were uneventful. The air smelled like damp earth, and the trees swayed in the wind, making soft creaking noises. My job was simple. Make sure no one vandalized the place, keep an eye on the property, and report anything suspicious. There was no electricity in the cabin, just an old oil lamp and a wood stove. My phone barely had a signal, but I didn't think much of it at first. It was on the fourth night that things started feeling off. I was lying on the small cot near the back of the cabin, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something stale. I heard footsteps outside, not the kind animals make, not the skittering of small feet, but slow, deliberate steps on the gravel path. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. I waited. Nothing. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, making it hard to hear anything else. I swept the beam across the headstones, expecting to see some animal or maybe a person. Nothing. The graveyard was still, as if it had been that way for years. I stood there for a while, my breath visible in the cold night air. Then I turned back to the cabin. The door was open. I knew for a fact I had closed it when I stepped out. The heavy wooden door didn't just swing open on its own. My chest tightened. I stepped inside, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. Everything looked the same except for one thing. The chair by the small wooden table had moved. It had been pushed back slightly, just enough to be noticeable. I stared at it, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I had left it like that. Maybe the wind had nudged it. I forced myself to sit back on the cot, trying to shake the unease creeping into my gut. I barely slept that night. By the next morning, I had almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. I went about my usual routine, checking the perimeter, making sure the gate was locked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I locked the cabin door and pushed the chair against it. I told myself it was just to be sure, that I was being overly cautious for no reason. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Hours passed. The air outside was dead still, not even the sound of the wind through the trees. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were closer this time. Slow, steady steps on the gravel. My body tensed as I listened. Then they stopped right outside the door. I held my breath. The air inside the cabin felt suffocating. The chair against the door didn't move, but I knew someone, or something, was just on the other side. Minutes passed. I gripped the flashlight, every muscle in my body stiff. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, the footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were deep, pressed into the ground, leading from the tree line to the door and then back again. But that wasn't the worst part. There was another set, smaller, lighter, as if someone or something had been standing right next to whoever had been outside my door. I packed my bag that morning, telling myself I was done. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about looking paranoid. But something made me stay one more night. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. That night, I sat awake in the chair, flashlight in one hand, a rusted hunting knife I found in the cabin in the other. I didn't plan on sleeping. The footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. Then a sound, not footsteps, not the wind, a whisper, came from right outside the thin wooden wall, barely audible. A dry, rasping breath. I gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. Then something touched the window, a slow, dragging movement against the glass. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond. The sound of fingertips scraping lightly against the glass sent chills through me. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting. The air inside the cabin was thick with something unseen, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, it was worse. It was the feeling of being watched. The footsteps never returned after that night. But I still left the next morning, not bothering to explain anything to the people who had hired me. I didn't need to. As I walked away, I glanced back at the graveyard one last time. In the daylight, it looked like any other abandoned cemetery, overgrown and forgotten. But I knew better, and as I drove away, I could still hear it. The slow, dragging whisper against the glass. I never went back. It was late November when I drove up to the old hunting cabin. The days had grown short, and the air carried that damp, biting cold that seeped into your bones. It had been raining on and off for the last week, and everything outside looked dull and washed out. The trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The cabin belonged to my uncle, but he hardly ever used it. He had built it years ago with a couple of his friends, back when they were still young enough to enjoy hunting trips. Now, he mostly let it sit there, untouched, except for the occasional visit from me or one of his friends. He had given me a key and told me I could use it whenever I wanted. That weekend, I needed the quiet. I had been going through a rough patch. Work had been stressful, and I just wanted some time away from everything. No people, no traffic, no noise. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. The drive up was uneventful. It took about 4 hours from where I lived, most of it spent on long, winding roads that cut through endless stretches of forest. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting dark. The place sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The closest road was half a mile away, which meant no cars, no sounds of civilization. Just the wind, the trees, and whatever animals were out there. I parked my truck in front of the cabin and stepped out. The air was damp, and the ground was soft beneath my boots. I grabbed my bag from the back and made my way up the wooden steps. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a cot against the wall. It had no electricity, no running water, but it had everything I needed for a weekend. Inside, the air was stale. I could still smell the faint traces of old wood smoke from the last time someone had used the place. I set my bag down, took off my coat, and got to work. The first thing I did was start a fire in the wood stove. The place got cold fast at night, and I didn't want to be shivering in my sleeping bag. As the fire crackled, I unpacked my supplies. Mostly canned food, a flashlight, some extra batteries, and a book I had brought along to pass the time. I wasn't planning on doing much. Maybe some hiking in the morning, maybe just sitting on the porch with a coffee, listening to the woods. I was heating up a can of soup when I first noticed something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling. I stepped outside to grab more firewood. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, making them creak and groan. The clearing was quiet except for that sound. Too quiet. Usually, even at night, you'd hear animals. The distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustling of something moving through the underbrush. But there was nothing, just the wind and the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the cold had driven the animals deeper into the woods. I grabbed an armful of firewood and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was uneventful. I ate my soup, read for a while by flashlight, then rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot and called it a night. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the room. Everything was quiet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch, like a footstep on wet leaves. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, this time closer. My heart started pounding. There shouldn't be anyone out here. The nearest house was miles away. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it toward the window. The glass was dirty, but I could see just enough of the clearing outside. Nothing. I sat there for a long time listening. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the faint crackling of the last embers in the stove. I told myself it had just been an animal. Maybe a deer passing through, maybe a raccoon sniffing around. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise outside made me tense up, waiting for something else to happen. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some air. The ground was damp, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. I walked around to the back of the cabin, stretching my legs. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. I followed them with my eyes. They had come from the trees, stopping just a few feet from the cabin. Right outside my window, a sick feeling settled in my gut. Someone had been out here last night, watching. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just the empty woods. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe some hunter had gotten turned around and passed by my cabin. Maybe it was nothing. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling. I went for a short hike, but I couldn't relax. Every time the wind moved the branches, I found myself looking over my shoulder. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. That night, I locked the door, made sure the fire was strong, and sat on the cot with my flashlight in hand. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I turned off my flashlight and sat completely still. My heart was hammering. The steps moved closer. Then they stopped, right outside my window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then a single tap on the glass. Soft, almost playful. I gripped my flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I wanted to look, wanted to shine the light on whoever was out there. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the window, waiting. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, slowly, back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At the first light of dawn, I packed up my things and got the hell out of there. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin. The footprints were still there, clear as day. And just beneath the window, a single handprint on the glass. Smudged, long fingers, pressed against the dirty surface. Watching, I never went back. I never planned on living in that cabin. It wasn't some dream I had or a decision I made because I wanted to be close to nature. It was just something I ended up with. The place belonged to my grandfather. He had built it decades ago, deep in the woods, far from any town or city. When he passed away, my father inherited it, and when my father passed, it became mine. It wasn't much, just a simple wooden structure with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area. There was no plumbing, no electricity, and no road leading to it. Just trees, endless trees in every direction. At first, I thought about selling it, but no one wanted a cabin that deep in the forest, at least not for the kind of money I would have needed to make it worth it. So it sat there and used, collecting dust. That was until life fell apart for me. I lost my job, went through a rough breakup, and found myself with no real place to go. The idea of living in a city, surrounded by people, felt unbearable. So I made the decision to move into the cabin, at least for a while. I figured it would give me time to clear my head, get my life together, and figure out what was next. The first few weeks were peaceful. The days were long and quiet. I spent most of my time chopping wood, hunting, and trying to make the place livable. Nights were different. They weren't peaceful. They were long, dark, and filled with noises I wasn't used to. The sound of branches breaking, rustling in the bushes, and occasionally, something that sounded much heavier moving in the distance. I told myself it was just animals. The woods were full of them, deer, foxes, maybe even bears. That's what I told myself. One night, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't like the usual noises. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps, heavy, close. I grabbed my rifle, sat up in bed, and listened. The steps stopped right outside the cabin. I didn't move. I just sat there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal after all. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Large ones. Not boots, not shoes, but bare feet. Human. They led from the woods to my cabin, stopped right outside the door, and then went back the way they came. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here, barefoot, in the middle of the night? I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, maybe just some weird trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I locked the door, shut the windows, and kept my rifle close. I barely slept. Every sound made my body tense. Every creak of the wood, every rustle outside, sent waves of fear through me. But nothing happened. A few more nights passed without incident, and I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the footprints had been there for days, and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe they weren't even human, and I had just imagined it in my half-asleep state. But then, I started noticing other things. Little things. My axe wasn't where I had left it. The pile of firewood I had stacked was knocked over. My hunting knife, which I kept on the small wooden table inside, was on the floor one morning. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of my door handle moving. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, slow. Someone was trying to open my door. I sat up, gripping my rifle, heart hammering in my chest. The handle rattled again, harder this time. The door was locked, but I wasn't sure how strong the lock was. My grandfather had built the cabin a long time ago, and I hadn't replaced it. I stayed completely still. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Breathing, right outside the door. Heavy, slow breathing. I didn't move. I barely even breathed myself. Minutes passed. The breathing didn't stop. It just stayed there, right on the other side of the wooden door, steady and calm like whoever or whatever. It knew I was inside and was just waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever before I heard slow, heavy footsteps moving away from the door, back into the woods. I didn't move for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they were all around the cabin. Dozens of them, some fresh, some older. Some leading to the windows, some circling the structure, and all of them barefoot. I packed my things. I didn't take much, just my rifle, my knife, and a small bag of supplies. I left everything else behind. I didn't even lock the door. I just walked away. I made my way back to the main road, which took almost a full day. When I finally reached my truck, I got in and drove, not stopping until I reached a motel a few towns over. I didn't sleep that night either. I just sat in bed, staring at the door, listening to the silence. I never went back to the cabin. I never tried to sell it. I never even told anyone what happened. I just left it there, abandoned in the woods, and I never looked back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in those woods. And whoever was out there had been watching me long before I ever noticed them. I never expected to inherit a cabin. When my uncle passed away, the last thing on my mind was property. He had been a quiet man, someone who kept to himself, never married, never had kids. He lived in a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I hadn't seen him much growing up, only on a few family gatherings when he would sit in the corner, nursing a drink, barely speaking. After the funeral, I was told he left me everything. I didn't have a choice but to go see it. I wasn't particularly close to him, but it felt wrong to just leave his place abandoned. Maybe I'd sell it. Maybe I'd fix it up. Either way, I needed to see it for myself. I packed up my truck and drove out there, following an old map left in the paperwork from the lawyer. There were no proper roads leading to the cabin, just dirt trails that cut through dense forest. The deeper I drove, the worse the path got. It was clear no one had been out there for a long time. My truck's tires crunched over dead leaves and twigs, the suspension groaning as I climbed uneven ground. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped low. The air smelled like damp wood and pine needles. It was exactly what you'd expect. An old, single-story structure with a sagging roof and dark windows. A small porch wrapped around the front, the wood warped from years of exposure. I stepped out of my truck and immediately felt the weight of the place. It was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. The cabin had one main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen off to the side, and a single bedroom in the back. The furniture was old but sturdy. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a threadbare couch pushed against the wall. Everything was just as my uncle had left it. There were cans of food stacked neatly in the kitchen, some probably a decade old. His tools were still hanging on the wall, untouched. I ran my hand over the fireplace mantle and wiped off a layer of dust. Something about the place unsettled me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to stay the night. The drive back was too long, and I wanted to go through his things in the morning. I set up my sleeping bag on the couch, checked that the door was locked, and tried to get some rest. That was the first night I heard it. A scraping sound like something dragging across the porch. It was subtle, almost like an animal nosing around. I held still, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. My heart started to pound. I sat up, straining to hear. Then silence. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. The forest was full of animals. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep much. By morning, the feeling of unease hadn't faded. I walked outside, scanning the area. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and impenetrable. I circled the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was disturbed near the porch steps. Drag marks in the dirt, long and deep. I tried to shake it off. Maybe an animal had been rooting around. I spent the day going through my uncle's belongings. There wasn't much. Some old hunting gear, clothes, a few notebooks filled with messy handwriting. One thing caught my attention, a rifle leaning against the wall by the fireplace, fully loaded. Felt strange. My uncle was the kind of man who would never leave a weapon loaded unless he had a reason to. That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle close. The sound came again, a slow, dragging scrape across the porch. This time, I was wide awake. I gripped the rifle, my breath shallow. The noise moved toward the front door, a soft thud, like something pressing against the wood. I forced myself to move. I stepped toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The cabin had no curtains, so I could see the porch clearly. Nothing. But then I caught it, a shape just beyond the trees, too tall for an animal, standing completely still. I froze, my grip tightening on the rifle. Then slowly it moved, not toward the cabin, but around it, circling. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It took nearly an hour before the forest went still again. To first light, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. I locked up the cabin, threw my bag into the truck, and got inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life and I threw it into gear. I didn't look back. The drive back was rough. The trails seemed more uneven, the trees pressing in closer. Every shadow felt wrong. And then, halfway down the road, I saw them. Footprints, deep, pressed into the mud, leading from the direction of the cabin. They weren't human. Not quite. I kept driving. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't try to sell it. I didn't tell anyone what happened. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that sound. The slow, dragging scrape of something moving across wood. And I wonder if it ever really stopped following me. I inherited my grandfather's old army cabin in the woods after he passed away in 2018. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a small storage shed beside it, deep in the middle of nowhere. It sat on the edge of a thick forest, with an old gravel road leading in from the highway. I hadn't been there since I was a kid. The last time I visited, I was probably 9 or 10, running around in the trees while my grandfather chopped wood. It was strange to think about him being gone. The place had been sitting empty for years, and I had no real plans for it. It was too isolated for me to live in, but I figured I could fix it up, maybe use it as a hunting retreat. I had no idea what kind of shape it was in, but I took a week off work, packed up my truck, and drove out there alone to see what I was dealing with. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road leading to the cabin was rough, full of potholes and overgrown with weeds. I had to go slow, watching for fallen branches. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I wasn't sure if I was relieved or worried. The place looked mostly intact, but it was clear that no one had been here in a long time. The wooden walls were weathered, and the tin roof was rusted. The small porch sagged in places, and the storage shed was half hidden behind tall grass. I killed the engine and got out, stretching my legs. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. It had rained recently, and the dirt road was still wet. I walked up to the front door, key in hand, but when I tried to unlock it, I realized it wasn't locked at all. The door creaked open with a push. That was the first thing that made me uneasy. I was sure my grandfather always locked up when he left. Inside, the air was stale. Dust covered everything. The single cot in the corner was bare, just an old metal frame with a thin mattress on top. A small wood stove sat near the wall, with a pile of logs stacked beside it. The cabinets were still stocked with a few rusted cans of food, long expired. A hunting rifle rested on a rack above the door, just where I remembered it. I spent the next couple of hours cleaning up. I swept out the dust, checked for leaks in the roof, and aired out the place. I had brought enough supplies to last a few days: food, water, and a sleeping bag. My plan was to stay until the weekend, do some minor repairs, and see if the cabin was worth fixing up. As the sun started setting, I made a small fire outside and cooked some canned stew over the flames. The forest was quiet, apart from the occasional rustling in the bushes. I figured it was just animals. The woods were full of deer, raccoons, and other creatures. I wasn't worried about it. That changed when I went to check out the shed. The door was slightly ajar, like someone had been inside recently. I pushed it open and stepped inside, using my flashlight to cut through the darkness. The inside was mostly empty, just some old tools, a pile of firewood, and a few rusted cans of gasoline. But then I noticed something that hadn't been there before: a pile of clothing. At first, I thought it might have been my grandfather's, left behind years ago. But the clothes didn't look old. They weren't covered in dust like everything else. There was a jacket, a pair of jeans, and a t-shirt, all crumpled up in the corner. And next to them, a half-empty water bottle. Someone had been here. Recently, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I backed out of the shed, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. The forest was dark now, the trees thick and unmoving. I listened, but I didn't hear anything. I locked the cabin door that night. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, heart pounding. Took me a moment to realize why. There was a sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A faint crunching, like footsteps moving through the leaves. Slow, deliberate. I reached for the hunting rifle above the door. I didn't load it, but I kept it close. The footsteps stopped. I sat there in the dark, waiting, listening. My breath was too loud in the silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard them again. Closer this time. Something was out there. Someone. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, gripping the rifle, staring at the door. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving slowly around the walls. They paused near the window, then kept going. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, rifle in hand. There were footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They led from the trees to the cabin, circling it once before disappearing back into the woods. Whoever had been out there hadn't tried to break in. They had just watched. I spent the morning on edge, checking the area for anything else that seemed off. I found nothing. The footprints were the only sign that someone had been here. I tried to tell myself it was just a hiker, someone passing through, but I knew better. There were no trails out here.
No campsites.
No reason for anyone to be wandering this deep into the woods. I decided to leave that night. I packed up my things, loaded them into my truck, and locked the cabin behind me. As I drove back down the gravel road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the path behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't sell it, didn't tell anyone what happened. I just let it sit there, untouched, slowly being swallowed by the forest. I still think about it sometimes. Whoever was out there that night, watching me circling the cabin, had been there before I arrived. Maybe they had been living in the shed. Maybe they had just been passing through. But I know one thing for sure. They knew I was there, and they didn't want me to stay. I had always known about my uncle's old cabin in the bushland of New South Wales. It had been there for as long as I could remember, sitting in a clearing surrounded by dense eucalyptus trees. He used it for hunting trips mostly, and sometimes just to get away from the city. I had been there a couple of times when I was younger, but not for years. It wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd go for a relaxing weekend. It was remote, far from any town, and the nearest neighbor was probably 20 kilometers away. There was no phone reception, no electricity apart from a dodgy old generator, and no running water except for what collected in the rainwater tank outside. When my uncle passed away, he left the cabin to me. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just an old, forgotten structure in the middle of nowhere, something that I assumed I'd end up selling or letting rot away. But then life got heavy. Work was a mess. My relationship had fallen apart, and I needed to clear my head. That's when I decided to spend a week up there, alone. Just me, the quiet, and whatever was left of my uncle's old life. I packed up supplies, enough food, water, and fuel for the generator to last me at least a week. The drive out was long and uneventful, mostly dirt roads leading further and further away from civilization. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The place looked just like I remembered. Weathered wood, tin roof, and a small front porch with an old chair that creaked in the wind. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and aged timber. My uncle had left it exactly as it was the last time he stayed. A small cot against the far wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, a few shelves lined with canned goods, and a single window overlooking the trees. There was a rifle propped against the wall next to the door, just like I remembered. I wasn't much of a hunter, but out here it felt like something I should keep close. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time chopping firewood, fixing up small things around the cabin, and walking through the bush. There were signs of wildlife everywhere. Kangaroo tracks near the clearing, birds calling from the trees, and the occasional rustling in the undergrowth. At night, the place was dead silent, except for the wind through the trees and the occasional distant cry of a dingo. On the third night, something changed. I was inside, sitting by the small fire I had built in the stove, reading an old book my uncle had left behind. The cabin was quiet, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirp of an insect outside. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human, slow, deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves just beyond the clearing. I froze, listening. The steps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then they started again, moving closer. I reached for the rifle without thinking. I had seen no one for days. No hikers, no campers, nothing. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I stood up slowly, moving to the window. The firelight inside made it hard to see out into the dark, but I could just make out movement near the tree line. A shape standing still, watching. My grip on the rifle tightened. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to call out. I just stood there, staring out at the dark, hoping that whoever it was would just turn around and walk away. Then the figure moved fast, too fast, not running, but stepping quickly, deliberately, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves as they moved around the clearing, staying just beyond the reach of the dim porch light. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The footsteps slowed again, stopping just outside the door. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the rifle, staring at the door, waiting for the handle to turn. It never did. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair, the rifle across my lap, listening to every creak and shift of the old wood around me. The fire burned down to embers, and I let the darkness settle in around me. By morning, there was no sign of anything. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to say that someone had been there. I told myself it had to be my imagination, that I had let my own mind play tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. I was outside, standing near the edge of the clearing, looking up at the stars. The night was quiet, just the usual sounds of the bush. Then that feeling hit me, like I was being watched. I turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the clearing. Too far to make out any details, but close enough that I could see it was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I raised the rifle not to shoot, but just to make it clear that I wasn't someone to mess with. The figure didn't react. I called out one word, "Hey!" Nothing. Then slowly they stepped back, not turning around, just stepping backward into the darkness of the trees until they were gone. I didn't sleep that night either. I stayed inside, lights off, rifle ready. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin, stopping and starting, just like before. I thought about firing a shot into the air, but I didn't want to give away that I was scared. I didn't want to let them know I was rattled. Morning came and I made my decision. I packed up my things, loaded everything into my truck, and got out of there. I didn't care that I had planned to stay the whole week. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to find out what happened if I stuck around. I never went back. I sold the cabin cheap to some guy who wanted a hunting lodge. I didn't tell him what happened. Maybe I didn't want to admit that it had happened at all. Maybe I just wanted to forget. But sometimes late at night I think about it. About the footsteps. About the figure watching from the trees. And I wonder if the guy who bought the cabin ever saw them too. I had always been close to my Uncle Sam. He was a quiet, self-reliant man who had spent most of his life deep in the wilderness. He owned a small hunting cabin in Montana, nestled in thick pine forests miles away from the nearest town. When he passed away unexpectedly in 2014, he left the cabin to me. I wasn't sure what to do with it at first, but eventually, I decided to take a week off work and spend some time there, partly to honor his memory and partly to figure out if I wanted to keep the place. The drive took me nearly 6 hours. The last stretch was the hardest, a winding single-lane dirt road that seemed to go on forever. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already dipped low behind the trees. It was a sturdy, well-built place, made of thick logs and resting on a small clearing near the base of a mountain. It had no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and an old gas-powered generator my uncle had used sparingly. I spent the first evening settling in. There wasn't much to do besides chop some wood, check the water pump, and make sure the roof hadn't developed any leaks. Felt good being out there, alone in the quiet. I had spent summers here as a kid, learning to hunt and fish with my uncle, and it felt strangely comforting to be back. That night, I sat on the small porch, listening to the wind in the trees. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I had been dozing off in my chair when I heard something outside, just past the tree-line. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My first thought was a deer, maybe even a bear, but the sound was too precise, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the edge of the woods, but I didn't see anything. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination and went inside to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the trees. They weren't from any animal I could recognize. Long, narrow prints, almost human but just slightly off. They trailed around the clearing before vanishing into the undergrowth. I felt uneasy but convinced myself it was just some trick of erosion or maybe a bear stepping in a weird way. I spent the day exploring, hiking up the mountain a bit, trying to shake the nagging feeling that something was watching me. That night, I barricaded the door. I wasn't sure why, just a gut feeling. The noises started again, just past the trees. This time, it was more than footsteps. I heard my name. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It sent a bolt of ice through my chest. I stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, every hair on my body standing on end. My uncle had once told me that if you ever hear something calling your name in the woods, you never answer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The voice came again, closer this time. It sounded wrong, like someone who had only ever heard my name spoken a few times trying to imitate it. I stayed awake the entire night, rifle clutched in my hands. The noises continued, pacing back and forth just outside the clearing, sometimes close enough that I swore I could hear breathing near the walls of the cabin. At some point, it stopped. Dawn came, and with it, a sickening feeling that I had just barely escaped something I didn't understand. The next few days blurred together. I barely slept. I rarely left the cabin, and when I did, I carried my rifle and checked my surroundings constantly. The footprints returned every morning, circling closer and closer. The whispering never stopped. Sometimes it was my name, other times it was garbled nonsense in a tone that was disturbingly familiar. It was mimicking my voice now, repeating words I had spoken earlier in the day, but twisted, distorted like a bad recording. The final night, I knew I had to leave. I packed up as much as I could, forcing myself to wait until sunrise. The whispering was worse than ever, coming from multiple directions. I heard laughter, low, guttural, and completely devoid of emotion. Something heavy pressed against the cabin walls, just beyond the wooden planks. I could hear fingers, long, scraping fingers, dragging across the surface, testing the wood. As soon as the first light broke, I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I jumped into my truck, fired up the engine, and tore down the dirt road, not caring if I wrecked the suspension. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement. I never went back. I put the cabin up for sale, but no one wanted it. A few years later, it burned down in a wildfire, and I can't say I was sad to see it go. I don't know what was out there in those woods, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear my name whispered in a voice that doesn't belong to me. I never planned on living in the cabin. It was just supposed to be a place to visit, something I could hold on to after my uncle passed away. He left it to me in his will, along with a few acres of land deep in the countryside, far from the nearest town. I hadn't seen him in years, but I remembered the place well from when I was younger. He used to take me out there when I was a kid, teaching me how to fish and hunt. It was quiet, peaceful even, but isolated. I didn't need the cabin. I had a place in the city, a job, a routine. But after his death, something made me want to go back, at least for a little while. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe guilt. I don't know. Either way, I packed up my truck with supplies and made the long drive out there, figuring I'd spend a few weeks cleaning it up, maybe get some repairs done, and then decide whether to keep it or sell it. The drive out was exactly as I remembered. Long, empty stretches of road, thick trees on either side, the occasional sign pointing towards some forgotten side road. The cabin sat about a mile off the main road, down a narrow dirt path that was barely visible through the overgrowth. By the time I pulled up to the place, it was late afternoon, the sky a dull gray that promised rain. The cabin was still standing, but it was rough. The wood was weathered, the roof sagged in places, and the porch creaked under my weight. The door was locked, but the key still worked, and when I stepped inside, I was hit with the stale smell of dust and old wood. The furniture was just as I remembered, heavy, dark, built to last. A few dead leaves had blown in through cracks in the walls, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. I spent the first few hours cleaning. I swept, dusted, and checked to make sure the plumbing still worked. The water ran brown for a minute before clearing up, and the electricity, powered by an old generator out back, kicked on with a low hum. I had enough fuel to keep it running for a while, but I made a mental note to get more. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, and sat on the porch listening to the wind move through the trees. It was quiet out there, almost too quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling in the underbrush and the soft creaking of the cabin settling. The next few days were spent working. I patched holes in the roof, replaced rotting boards on the porch, and cleared out the shed out back. The place was starting to feel livable again, and a small part of me started to consider keeping it. It wasn't until the fourth night that I noticed something was off. I had just finished stacking firewood near the back of the cabin when I saw it, a set of footprints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were mine, but when I looked closer, I realized they were different. The prints were larger, the tread on the soles not matching my boots. They led from the edge of the trees to the side of the cabin, stopping just below one of the windows. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. A cold breeze moved through the trees, rustling the branches. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an old set of prints I hadn't noticed before. Still, I felt uneasy. I locked the doors that night, double-checking the windows before going to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise outside had me on edge. The wind, the creaking wood, the occasional snap of a branch. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping, like something dragging across wood. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed the rifle I had brought with me, not knowing if I'd need it, but feeling better having it. I moved slowly to the window, careful not to make a sound. The moon was out, casting just enough light to see. Someone was standing by the woodpile, a tall figure, partially hidden in the shadows, their face obscured by the angle. They were just standing there, motionless. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched. After what felt like forever, the figure turned and walked back toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, rifle in hand, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. By morning, the footprints were still there, leading from the woods to the woodpile and back again. No sign of who had made them, no indication of what they had been doing. I spent the next day on edge, checking my surroundings every few minutes. I considered leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it had been a hunter passing through, someone lost. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, not scraping, breathing, soft, slow, just outside the window. I didn't move. My fingers tightened around the rifle. The breathing stayed there for what felt like minutes before fading away. By the time morning came, I had made my decision. I packed my things, loaded up the truck, and left. I never went back. A few weeks later, I listed the cabin for sale. It sat on the market for months before someone finally bought it. I never spoke to them, never warned them. I didn't want to know if they saw footprints too. I had never built a cabin before, but I had always wanted to. Something about having a place of my own, far away from everything, made sense to me. I had spent years working in construction, laying bricks, pouring foundations, and raising houses that I would never live in. The idea of putting all that work into something that belonged only to me, it felt right. So when I found a patch of land deep in the woods, I bought it without hesitation. The place was far enough from town that no one would bother me, but still close enough that I could make supply runs when I needed to. The land had once belonged to an old logger, but he had died years ago, and his family had let the property go. It was perfect. I planned the whole thing carefully. I would clear the trees, lay the foundation, and build the cabin by myself. It would take time, but I wasn't in a hurry. I wanted to do it right. I wanted the place to last. The first few weeks were spent clearing trees. I used an old chainsaw and the work was slow. Some of the trees were massive, their roots twisting deep into the ground like claws. Cutting them down wasn't too hard, but dragging them out of the way was a different story. The deeper I worked into the property, the harder it got. Some nights, I slept in my truck, too tired to drive back to town. The nights were quiet, except for the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, but after a while, I started to notice little things. At first, it was just a feeling, like I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to being out there by myself. A guy spends too much time alone in the woods, his mind starts playing tricks on him. But then, I started noticing signs that someone, or something, had been through my work site when I wasn't there. The first time, I figured it was an animal. I had left some tools out by mistake, and when I came back the next morning, they had been moved. Not stolen, just moved, like someone had picked them up and set them down in a different place. Then there were the footprints. They weren't mine. I wore thick work boots, and these prints were smaller, bare, like someone had been walking around without shoes. They led away from my work site and disappeared into the trees. I didn't know what to make of it, but I wasn't going to let it stop me. I had put too much time into this already. I kept working. Laying the foundation was backbreaking work. I dug out the ground by hand, pouring concrete footings and making sure everything was level. I was out there from sunup to sundown, sweating through my shirt, dirt and dust caking my skin. I barely noticed how quiet it had gotten. Then, one evening, I looked up and saw someone standing at the tree line. I froze. The figure was too far away for me to see clearly, but I could tell it was a man. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I wiped the sweat from my face and took a step forward, but before I could say anything, he turned and walked back into the woods. I waited, listening, but I didn't hear anything.
No footsteps.
No breaking branches, just silence. I should have left then. I should have packed up and gone back to town. But I didn't. I kept working. Once the foundation was done, I started on the frame. The days passed in a blur of wood, nails, and sweat. The cabin started taking shape. I worked through the long summer days and into the cool autumn evenings. The nights came sooner now, and they felt darker somehow. I started locking up my tools when I left. Something about the way that figure had watched me from the trees stuck with me. I still didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I didn't want to find out. One morning, I arrived to find deep scratches gouged into the wooden beams of my half-finished cabin. Not animal scratches. Long, deliberate marks like someone had dragged a knife or a blade across the wood. I stared at them for a long time. Then, I got back to work. The cabin came together slowly. The walls went up, then the roof. I installed the windows and fitted the door. I was proud of what I had built, but I wasn't comfortable out there anymore. I didn't stay the nights. I finished my work, packed up my tools, and left before the sun went down. Then one night I came back to find the door open. I knew I had locked it. The inside was empty, but something felt off. I could feel it in the air, that thick, suffocating stillness. I checked every corner of that cabin, but there was no sign of anyone.
No footprints.
No tracks, but I knew someone had been inside. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I decided I was done. I had built my cabin. I had finished what I started, but I wasn't staying. I loaded up my truck and left. The last time I saw the cabin was in my rearview mirror. Stood there, solid and strong, exactly the way I had built it. But I knew I wouldn't be back. I had built something for myself, a place where I could be alone. But I had never been alone out there. Not really.